The late September afternoon cast a golden glow across the grounds of Meadowbank House, where Mrs. Lydia Thornfield had arranged what she called a celebration of remembrance for her late husband. It had been precisely 18 months since Commander Thornfield's sudden passing, and his widow had decided that the time for black crape and drawn curtains had ended. Today, she would light a memorial candle in the rose garden he had so lovingly tended, surrounded by those who had known and respected him. Miss Jane Marple, visiting her great-niece in the neighboring village of Little Wickham, had been invited as a courtesy to the local community. She sat contentedly on a wrought-iron bench beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak, her knitting in her lap and her pale blue eyes taking in the scene with the gentle interest of someone who found human nature endlessly fascinating. The gathering was intimate, perhaps 20 souls in total, yet she could already sense the undercurrents that flowed beneath the surface of polite conversation like hidden streams beneath a meadow. Mrs. Thornfield moved among her guests with practiced grace, a handsome woman in her early 40s whose mourning attire had given way to a becoming dress of deep purple silk. She had, Miss Marple noted, the particular poise of someone who had grown comfortable with being the center of attention. Not unpleasantly so, but with the confidence that comes from knowing one's place in the social order. Her late husband's naval pension and life insurance had left her quite comfortably situated, and she had used the past months to establish herself as something of a patroness of local arts and charities. The centerpiece of the afternoon was to be the lighting of a special memorial candle, crafted by Mrs. Thornfield herself as part of what she described as her therapeutic journey through grief. She had taken up candle-making with considerable enthusiasm, and her creations, elaborate affairs scented with herbs from the commander's garden, had become quite sought after in the village. Today's candle was her masterpiece, a tall pillar of deep blue wax embedded with dried rosemary and lavender, designed to burn for exactly 1 hour in tribute to her husband's memory. Among the guests, Miss Marple observed several individuals whose reactions to their hostess seemed worthy of attention. Dr. Marcus Pembroke, the family physician who had attended the commander in his final illness, stood near the memorial rose-bed with the slightly strained expression of a man carrying uncomfortable knowledge. Mrs. Violet Ashford, the commander's younger sister, had arrived from London that morning and appeared to be studying her sister-in-law with barely concealed disapproval. Young Mr. Jeremy Caldwell, who had served as the commander's secretary and remained to help Mrs. Thornfield manage her affairs, hovered anxiously near a small table where several candles had been arranged for the ceremony. The Reverend Stephen Hartley provided a calming presence with his gentle manner, while Mrs. Prudence Blackwood, the village's unofficial chronicler of social events, had positioned herself strategically to observe all interactions. Miss Marple recognized in Mrs. Blackwood a kindred spirit in the art of observation, though perhaps one less practiced in discretion. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Mrs. Thornfield called for attention. "My dear friends," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the garden. "Charles always said that remembrance should be a celebration, not a lamentation. Today, I light this candle not in sorrow, but in gratitude for the years we shared and the garden he created for us all to enjoy." She moved toward the table where Mr. Caldwell had arranged 3 candles in a neat row. Each was identical in appearance, tall pillars of blue wax decorated with dried herbs. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the subtle differences that others might miss. The middle candle sat slightly askew from its fellows, and there was something about the way the wax caught the light that suggested a different composition. Mrs. Thornfield reached for what she clearly believed to be her memorial candle, the one on the left, which she had personally crafted and scented. But in her emotion, or perhaps in the gentle confusion that sometimes accompanies ceremony, her hand wavered and selected instead the middle candle, the one that seemed somehow different from its companions. "For Charles," she said softly, striking a match with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. "May his memory burn bright in all our hearts." The flame caught immediately, and for a moment all was as it should be. The assembled guests stood in respectful silence as the candle began to burn, its soft light flickering in the gentle evening breeze. Mrs. Thornfield closed her eyes briefly, as if in prayer, and inhaled deeply. It was then that everything went terribly wrong. The scent that rose from the burning candle was not the expected lavender and rosemary, but something else entirely, something sharp and acrid that made several guests step backward instinctively. Mrs. Thornfield's eyes flew open, and her expression changed from peaceful reverence to confusion, then to alarm, and finally to terror as she realized what was happening. She tried to speak, to call out, but her voice emerged as nothing more than a strangled whisper. Her hands flew to her throat, and she began to sway on her feet like a tree in a strong wind. Dr. Pembroke rushed forward, his medical training overriding social protocol, but even as he reached her side, Mrs. Thornfield collapsed onto the manicured lawn, her body convulsing briefly before falling ominously still. The memorial candle continued to burn serenely, its toxic fumes dispersing in the evening air as if nothing had happened. But something most definitely had happened, and as Dr. Pembroke knelt beside the motionless figure of their hostess, his grim expression confirmed what everyone had begun to suspect. Mrs. Lydia Thornfield, the widow who had meant to light a candle in loving memory of her husband, had instead lit the wrong candle entirely, one that had been deliberately designed not to honor the dead, but to create another victim. Miss Marple, her knitting needles still for once, observed the scene with the quiet intensity of someone who understood that in the space of a few moments a peaceful memorial had transformed into something far more sinister. Her eyes took in the remaining candles on the table, the expressions of shock and horror on the faces around her, and most particularly the subtle signs that would tell her who among this gathering had known exactly what would happen when the wrong candle was lit. In the gathering dusk, with the scent of roses mingling with something far more deadly, the game had begun in earnest. For a moment, the garden held its breath. Then, as if released from a spell, everyone began to move at once. Dr. Pembroke rose slowly from beside Mrs. Thornfield's still form, his face grave with the weight of professional certainty. "She's gone," he announced quietly, his voice cutting through the shocked murmurs that had begun to ripple through the gathering. "And I'm afraid this was no natural death." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of horror and disbelief through the assembled guests. Mrs. Prudence Blackwood pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, though Miss Marple noticed her eyes remained sharp and alert above the white linen. Young Mr. Caldwell stumbled backward from the candle table, his face draining of all color, while Mrs. Violet Ashford sat rigid in her chair, her knuckles white where they gripped the armrests. "We must not disturb anything further," Dr. Pembroke continued, his medical training asserting itself over the shock. "Jeremy, please telephone the police immediately, and I'm afraid everyone must remain here until they arrive." Miss Marple observed the scene with the quiet attention that had served her so well in previous encounters with human nature at its darkest. She noted how Jeremy's hands trembled as he turned toward the house, how Mrs. Ashford's expression seemed to shift between grief and something that might have been relief, and how the Reverend Hartley moved with practiced calm to offer comfort where it was needed most. But it was the candle table that drew her particular interest. Those three seemingly identical pillars, one now extinguished under a hastily placed glass cloche, the others standing silent, witness to whatever terrible substitution had taken place. The local constable arrived within 20 minutes, a young man named Rowe, whose pink face suggested he had never encountered anything more serious than bicycle theft. Behind him came Inspector Aberley from the county police, a lean, quietly observant man whose unhurried movements spoke of considerable experience with sudden death. He surveyed the scene with professional detachment, taking in the covered body, the extinguished candle, and the cluster of shocked faces watching his every move. "Dr. Pembroke," he said without preamble, "your assessment." Poison, Inspector. Inhaled, I believe, from whatever was burned in that candle. The symptoms were rapid and severe. Respiratory distress followed by collapse. She would have had very little time to call for help. Inspector Aberley nodded and turned his attention to the candle table. And these were all prepared by Mrs. Thornfield herself? It was Jeremy who answered, his voice barely steady. Yes, Inspector. She made them yesterday evening. 3 identical memorial candles, though only one was meant to be lit, the one on the left. I arranged them myself this afternoon, exactly as she instructed. Then why, Mrs. Ashford interjected sharply, did she light the middle one instead? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Jeremy's throat worked as he swallowed hard. I don't know, Mrs. Ashford. She reached for the memorial candle, but then her hand moved to the center. Perhaps she was overcome with emotion, or the light was confusing, or... People often choose the middle, Miss Marple said gently, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked. At church bazaars, you know, when there are 3 ribbons to choose from, the young ladies almost always select the center one. It appears more balanced somehow, more photogenic, if I may use such a modern term. Inspector Aberley's gaze sharpened with interest. You observed the selection process, Miss Marple, Jane Marple. And yes, I was watching quite carefully. Mrs. Thornfield seemed to hesitate for just a moment, as if uncertain, before making her choice. But then, memorial services can be quite emotional affairs. One's attention might easily wander. The inspector made a note, then addressed the group as a whole. I'll need to speak with each of you individually, but first, Mr. Caldwell, can you tell me where these candles were kept before today? Jeremy's face grew even paler. In the still room, Inspector. Mrs. Thornfield always locked it. She kept the key on her chain. She was very particular about her candle-making supplies. And who else had access to this key? The silence that followed was telling. Jeremy glanced around the group before answering reluctantly. I suppose. Well, I helped her sometimes with the heavier work, and she occasionally asked me to fetch supplies when she was entertaining. But the key never left her person, Inspector. She was quite protective of her hobby. Miss Marple found this detail particularly illuminating. A locked room, a key that never left the victim's possession, and yet somehow a poisoned candle had found its way among the memorial pieces. Either Mrs. Thornfield had been deceived about the contents of her own creation, or someone with her complete trust had gained access to her supplies. Inspector Aberley continued his preliminary examination, noting the slight differences in the candles that Mrs. Blackwood had observed earlier. The memorial candle showed the careful craftsmanship of someone working with love and attention, while the deadly substitute had a subtly different texture and a more haphazard arrangement of herbs. Mrs. Thornfield sold her candles occasionally, didn't she? The inspector asked. Through the Ladies' Guild, Jeremy confirmed. For the War Memorial Fund. She had an order for 3 dozen blue pillars, quite similar to these, to be delivered Wednesday next. She was very proud of the commission. Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. An order for similar candles, a delivery scheduled for Wednesday, and a memorial service that had gone tragically wrong. The timing seemed more than coincidental, though she kept this observation to herself for the moment. As the inspector continued his initial questioning, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to wander over the assembled guests. Each face told its own story: shock, fear, calculation, and in some cases, what appeared to be relief. Mrs. Ashford, in particular, seemed to be struggling with emotions that went far beyond simple grief for her sister-in-law. There had been tension there, Miss Marple was certain, though whether it was sufficient motive for murder remained to be seen. The evening shadows were lengthening now, casting the garden in shades of blue and gray that made the memorial roses appear almost spectral. Soon they would all be taken inside for formal statements, and the careful work of unraveling motive and opportunity would begin in earnest. But already, Miss Marple could see the shape of the puzzle beginning to emerge. A locked room that wasn't quite locked, a trusted relationship that had been betrayed, and a killer who had counted on the victim's own habits and emotions to ensure the success of their deadly substitution. The game, as she had learned to think of these tragic affairs, was indeed afoot. And somewhere among this gathering of seemingly respectable villagers, a murderer was no doubt congratulating themselves on what they believed to be the perfect crime. The drawing room at Meadowbank House had been hastily transformed into an interview chamber, its comfortable chintz furniture and watercolor landscapes providing an oddly domestic backdrop to Inspector Aberley's methodical questioning. The assembled guests sat in various states of shock and discomfort, the earlier convivial atmosphere now replaced by the heavy weight of suspicion that seemed to settle over the room like autumn fog. Miss Marple had positioned herself in a corner chair near the bay window, her knitting put away out of respect for the deceased, though her pale blue eyes remained as observant as ever. She watched the inspector with professional appreciation, noting how he managed to maintain an air of calm authority while drawing information from people who were clearly struggling to process what had occurred in their peaceful village gathering. The investigation begins. Inspector Aberley began with Dr. Pembroke, whose medical assessment provided the grim foundation for everything that would follow. The symptoms were consistent with rapid poisoning through inhalation. The doctor confirmed, his usual composed manner showing signs of strain. Whatever substance was burned in that candle was both potent and fast-acting. Mrs. Thornfield would have had very little time to call for help, even if she had understood what was happening to her. The inspector made careful notes before turning his attention to Jeremy Caldwell, whose obvious distress had only intensified since the discovery of the body. "Mr. Caldwell, you arranged the candles this afternoon. Please describe the process in detail." Jeremy's hands trembled as he clasped them in his lap. "Mrs. Thornfield showed me the memorial candle yesterday evening, the one on the left. She had placed it by the window in the still room to cure properly. She said the other two were for display, to create a more ceremonial appearance. I brought all three out at precisely 3 o'clock and arranged them in a row on the garden table, exactly as she had instructed. And between that time and the ceremony, did anyone approach the table?" "There was the florist delivery at 3:30, Jeremy replied, his voice growing more strained. "I signed for extra lilies at the side door. Mrs. Greeley came out to tell me that Reverend Hartley had arrived early, and Mrs. Blackwood asked about arranging her notebook. But the candles themselves, no, I don't believe anyone touched them." Miss Marple found this detail particularly interesting. In her experience, people often noticed far less than they believed they did, especially when their attention was divided among multiple tasks. The brief period when Jeremy was occupied with deliveries and early arrivals would have provided an opportunity for someone with sufficient knowledge and preparation. Financial revelations. It was Mrs. Prudence Blackwood who provided the first significant revelation about Mrs. Thornfield's circumstances, though she did so with a particular relish of someone sharing information that cast the deceased in a less flattering light. "Inspector, I feel I must mention that Lydia's financial situation was rather more precarious than appearances might suggest. The commander's investments were not as successful as his naval career, and the life insurance barely covered his debts. This intelligence clearly surprised several members of the group, particularly Jeremy, whose face showed genuine shock. Mrs. Violet Ashford, however, nodded grimly. I had suspected as much. Lydia had been systematically disposing of family items, silver, china, even some of Charles's naval memorabilia. She claimed it was simply practical household management, but I believe she was facing genuine financial pressure. The candle-making business was quite profitable. Mrs. Blackwood continued, warming to her theme. Nearly £20 a month, and there was talk of expansion. Correspondence with London shops, potential partnerships for proper distribution, quite ambitious for what she called a therapeutic hobby. Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing interest. A woman facing financial difficulties who had built a successful business around her craft, only to die from a poisoned version of her own creation. The irony was almost Shakespearean in its cruel precision. Family tensions. Mrs. Ashford's testimony revealed deeper currents of family discord that had been carefully hidden beneath the surface of polite mourning. Charles left certain family items to me in his will, things that had belonged to our parents. Lydia was reluctant to part with them, claiming sentimental value, though I suspected she was planning to sell them along with everything else. What sort of items? Inspector Aberley inquired. Jewelry that had belonged to our grandmother, some valuable books, and Charles's military medals. I discovered only last week that she had already sold the medals to a collector in Bath. Mrs. Ashford's voice carried a sharp edge of anger that had clearly been building for months. A woman desperate enough to sell her late husband's military honors is indeed facing serious pressure that might drive someone to extreme measures. Jeremy shifted uncomfortably at this accusation. Mrs. Ashford, Mrs. Thornfield was simply trying to maintain her independence while managing her resources responsibly. There was nothing improper about her actions. Perhaps not improper, Mrs. Ashford replied coldly, but certainly desperate. And desperate people, Inspector, sometimes make desperate choices. Physical evidence. Inspector Aberley's examination of the still room provided the most concrete evidence of deliberate sabotage. The room, which Mrs. Thornfield had converted specifically for her candle-making hobby, was a model of organization and security. Shelves of labeled jars containing herbs and oils stood in neat rows, while molds and tools were arranged with the precision of someone who took their craft seriously. The key to this room was kept on Mrs. Thornfield's person at all times. Mrs. Greeley, the housekeeper, confirmed. She was very particular about temperature and humidity control, said that careless handling could ruin weeks of work. But it was what Inspector Aberley found in the waste basket that provided the most damning evidence. Wrapped in tissue paper was a candle wick, neatly trimmed, its end stiff with some transparent substance that had darkened the fiber. Even from across the room, Miss Marple could see the slight glisten where it had been treated with something other than ordinary wax. Someone prepared this wick to burn differently from its fellows, the inspector announced to the assembled group. It was found discarded by the still room door, a clumsy oversight that suggests either haste or overconfidence. Even more significant was the discovery of an empty space on the lower shelf of the still room cupboard, where a parcel of blue candles had been prepared for delivery on Wednesday. The order was for 3 dozen memorial candles, similar to those used today, Jeremy confirmed. Mrs. Thornfield was very proud of the commission. It represented her largest single order. Village speculation. As the formal questioning continued, Miss Marple observed the subtle dynamics at work among the assembled villagers. Mrs. Blackwood had appointed herself the unofficial chronicler of events, her notebook filled with observations that would no doubt fuel gossip for months to come. The other guests had begun to form their own theories, each shaped by their particular understanding of human nature and their relationships with the deceased. Some focused on Jeremy's obvious access to the still room and his intimate knowledge of Mrs. Thornfield's habits. Others whispered about family tensions and inheritance disputes, while a few suggested that Mrs. Thornfield's financial desperation might have led her to make enemies among creditors or business associates. Miss Marple listened to these various theories with the patience of someone who understood that truth often emerged not from the loudest accusations, but from the smallest inconsistencies and the most carefully guarded secrets. Someone in this room had known exactly how Mrs. Thornfield would behave when faced with 3 identical candles, and they had prepared their deadly substitution with the confidence that comes from intimate knowledge of another person's habits and character. The pattern emerges. As the evening deepened and the initial shock gave way to more systematic investigation, Miss Marple began to see the outline of a carefully planned crime. The poisoned candle had not been a random act of malice, but a precisely calculated murder that depended on the victim's own predictable behavior. Someone had studied Mrs. Thornfield's habits, gained access to her supplies, and created a deadly trap disguised as a memorial to her late husband. The financial motives were clear enough, as were the family tensions and professional jealousies that swirled around the successful candle-making business. But Miss Marple sensed there were deeper currents at work, secrets that went beyond money or inheritance, touching on the fundamental human emotions of love, betrayal, and revenge that so often lay at the heart of village murders. The investigation was far from over, but already the careful observer could see that this case would hinge not on complex forensic evidence, but on the eternal verities of human nature that Miss Marple had spent a lifetime studying. Someone had lit the wrong candle with deadly precision, and before long, the truth would emerge from the shadows of Meadowbank House like a flame in the darkness. The morning after Mrs. Thornfield's shocking death dawned grey and sombre, with a persistent drizzle that seemed to mirror the pall that had settled over Meadowbank House. Inspector Aberley had established his temporary headquarters in the commander's study, where the late naval officer's charts and maritime memorabilia provided a strangely appropriate backdrop for the systematic unraveling of a carefully planned murder. Miss Marple, invited to remain as both witness and unofficial consultant, positioned herself in the morning room with her knitting, where the natural flow of household activity would bring each suspect within range of her patient observation. She had learned long ago that people revealed their true nature most clearly in the small, unguarded moments between formal questioning. The still-room investigation. Inspector Aberley's first order of business was a thorough examination of Mrs. Thornfield's candle-making sanctuary, accompanied by Mrs. Greeley and, at his specific request, Miss Marple herself. The still-room retained its pleasant aroma of wax and dried herbs, though now it was tainted with the metallic scent that seemed to linger wherever violent death had passed. The room's organization spoke of someone who took genuine pride in her craft. Shelves lined the walls with military precision, each jar labeled in Mrs. Thornfield's neat hand. Rosemary, spike lavender, bay, stearine, beeswax, essences. The workbench showed evidence of recent use, with molds arranged according to size and wicks wound carefully around dowels to prevent tangling. Mrs. Thornfield was most particular about this room, Inspector, Mrs. Greeley confirmed, her hands clasped firmly to prevent nervous fidgeting. The key never left her person, and if Mr. Caldwell needed supplies, he had to fetch her to unlock it herself. That's the honest truth. Inspector Aberley examined the wastebasket with particular care, retrieving the prepared wick he had discovered the previous evening. Even in daylight, the transparent substance that had stiffened the fiber was clearly visible, its sickly brown discoloration suggesting something far more sinister than ordinary candle wax. It was Miss Marple who noticed the small but telling details that others might overlook. "The ends of the wicks are tied here, Inspector," she observed mildly, pointing to a bundle secured to a wall peg. "Such a neat knot. Very firm indeed." The knot was a double overhand, laid flat upon itself with a precision that spoke of either professional training or considerable practice. Dr. Pembroke, who had followed them into the still room, shifted uncomfortably when Inspector Aberley's attention turned to the binding. "One must secure wicks properly," the doctor said defensively. "A loose wick can cause uneven burning. Anyone with knowledge of knots would understand that an extra turn helps secure the binding under strain." Miss Marple nodded pleasantly. "Of course, Doctor. My great-nephew's scout troop is always practicing such things, very useful in the garden when plants insist on growing where they shouldn't." On the lower shelf, the brown paper parcel labeled Meadowbank Blue, 3 dozies, Wednesday delivery, had been carefully opened and resealed with a pin. Inspector Aberley counted the contents methodically. 35 candles, he announced. "Should be 36 according to the order." "That's correct, sir," Mrs. Greeley confirmed. 3 dozen exactly when Mrs. Thornfield checked them yesterday evening. The mathematics were simple but telling. If Jeremy had taken 3 candles for the ceremony, 33 should have remained. The presence of 35 suggested that 1 candle had been removed and 2 had been returned, 1 genuine, one deadly substitute. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught another detail that might have been overlooked. "There's a smudge of blue wax on the door frame, Inspector," she said apologetically, indicating a mark at shoulder height. "When my friend Mr. Badger rearranged his pantry shelves, he left just such a mark, and his wife complained she could never keep her sleeves clean afterward. It does tend to transfer." The mark suggested someone tall had brushed against the frame while carrying wax, or perhaps someone had stood on a chair to reach higher shelves. Inspector Aberley made careful note of this detail before photographing the evidence. Revelations through conversation. Returning to the main house, Inspector Aberley found that the informal atmosphere of the morning room had encouraged the kind of unguarded conversation that often proved more revealing than formal interrogation. Mrs. Blackwood had appointed herself the unofficial chronicler of events, her notebook filled with observations that would fuel village gossip for months to come. "I've been reflecting on yesterday's events," she confided to Miss Marple over tea that no one seemed inclined to drink. "And I noticed several things that struck me as significant. Jeremy's behavior, for instance. He was increasingly agitated as the ceremony approached, checking his watch repeatedly and glancing toward the house as if expecting someone. More intriguingly, Mrs. Blackwood had observed Mrs. Ashford's movements with the sharp eye of someone accustomed to monitoring village comings and goings. She claimed to have arrived on the morning train from London, but I distinctly saw her walking past the post office at 7:30. One notices these things in a village this size. This revelation cast Mrs. Ashford's timeline in an entirely different light. If she had arrived hours earlier than claimed, it raised serious questions about how those additional hours had been spent and whether they might have included an unannounced visit to Meadowbank House. Dr. Pembroke's contribution to the morning's revelations proved equally significant, though he shared his information with obvious reluctance. "Mrs. Thornfield consulted me several weeks ago about symptoms of increasing anxiety and sleep disturbance," he admitted quietly. "She asked specifically about substances that might cause such symptoms when burned or inhaled, whether certain compounds could produce anxiety through vapor exposure." Miss Marple found this detail particularly illuminating. If Mrs. Thornfield had been experiencing symptoms suggesting gradual poisoning, yesterday's memorial ceremony might have been the culmination of a longer campaign of systematic poisoning rather than a single deadly act. She mentioned that the symptoms seemed worse in the evenings, particularly when she worked in her still room. Dr. Pembroke continued, "I suggested she might be developing sensitivity to her candle-making materials, but she dismissed this possibility quite emphatically. The business connection. It was Jeremy himself who provided the most startling revelation of the morning, though he did so inadvertently while defending his employer's reputation against suggestions of financial desperation. His loyalty to Mrs. Thornfield was evident in every word as he spoke with quiet intensity about her recent business developments. Mrs. Thornfield was not the desperate woman some have suggested, he insisted. She had recently entered into negotiations with a London firm specializing in artisanal products. They were prepared to offer her an exclusive contract that would have solved her financial difficulties permanently. This information caused a stir among the assembled guests, none of whom had been aware of such negotiations. Jeremy seemed to realize he had revealed more than intended, but continued under their expectant attention. The contract was to be signed this week, he admitted reluctantly. A guarantee of £50 per month for exclusive rights to her techniques and designs, with the possibility of much larger returns if the London market proved receptive. She was quite excited. It represented not just financial security, but recognition of her artistic abilities. Miss Marple absorbed this development with growing interest. If Mrs. Thornfield was on the verge of financial salvation, it eliminated desperation as a motive for self-harm, while simultaneously providing someone else with strong reasons for preventing the contract's completion. The mysterious visitor. Inspector Aberley's consultation with the gardener had yielded another crucial piece of information that began to tie the various threads together. The gardener reports a gentleman caller approximately 6 days ago. he announced to the assembled group. Someone claiming to represent a London shop, asking about the candle commission. They walked the garden and spoke privately with Mrs. Thornfield at the back step. No name was provided, but he was described as neat, well-dressed, with what the gardener called clever hands. Mrs. Blackwood leaned forward with obvious interest. Lydia would have been charmed by attention from London. She was always hoping for recognition beyond our little village. Jeremy looked genuinely shocked. I never met this man, and Mrs. Thornfield made no mention of him to me. She was usually quite forthcoming about business inquiries. Miss Marple found the timing significant. A mysterious visitor appearing just days before a memorial ceremony that would end in murder suggested careful planning and intimate knowledge of Mrs. Thornfield's schedule and habits. Growing suspicions. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple began to see the outline of a deception far more complex than simple murder motivated by greed or family discord. Someone had been systematically undermining Mrs. Thornfield's peace of mind through gradual poisoning, creating anxiety and sleep disturbance that would make her death appear to be the result of accumulated stress and desperation. The choice of delivery method through a candle was particularly sophisticated, playing upon the victim's own expertise while providing a means of death that would appear accidental to casual observation. Only someone with intimate knowledge of her candle-making process and her sentimental attachment to memorial ceremonies could have devised such an elaborate psychological trap. Inspector Aberley's focus had naturally settled on Jeremy Caldwell as the most obvious suspect. The young man's access to the still room, his knowledge of Mrs. Thornfield's habits, and his obvious distress could all be interpreted as evidence of guilt. The police were eager for a clear resolution, and Jeremy's proximity to the crime made him an appealingly straightforward solution. But Miss Marple had learned to distrust obvious solutions, particularly in cases where the method showed such sophisticated understanding of human psychology. The very convenience of Jeremy as a suspect made her increasingly certain that the true culprit was someone far more cunning, whose hand remained invisible while others drew suspicion upon themselves. The pattern emerges. As the investigation continued, Miss Marple observed the subtle reactions of each suspect with the patient attention that had served her well in previous encounters with village murder. Mrs. Ashford's composure seemed almost too perfect. Her declared lack of financial motive combined with obvious resentment, creating a complex psychological profile. Dr. Pembroke's medical knowledge and his uncomfortable awareness of Mrs. Thornfield's symptoms suggested involvement that went beyond professional duty. Even Reverend Hartley, with his gentle manner and pianist's hands, possessed the manual dexterity that the gardener had described as clever. The killer had counted on Mrs. Thornfield's predictable behavior when faced with 3 identical candles, but they had also demonstrated intimate knowledge of her business affairs, her family relationships, and her deepest fears about financial security. This was not a crime of passion or sudden opportunity, but a carefully orchestrated murder that had been months in the planning. As Inspector Aberley prepared for the next phase of his investigation, Miss Marple settled back with her knitting, confident that the truth would eventually emerge from the tangle of motives, opportunities, and carefully constructed deceptions. In her experience, murderers who believed themselves clever often proved to be their own undoing, betrayed by the very attention to detail that made their crimes seem perfect. The game, as she had come to think of these tragic affairs, was indeed becoming more interesting with each revelation. And somewhere among this gathering of seemingly respectable villagers, a killer was no doubt beginning to realize that their perfect crime might not be quite as perfect as they had believed. By noon, the persistent drizzle had transformed Meadowbank House into something resembling a scene from a melancholy watercolor, with mist clinging to the yew hedges and pearling the windows like tears. Inspector Aberley had established his command in the commander's study, where maritime charts and naval memorabilia provided an oddly fitting backdrop for the methodical unraveling of what was proving to be a most carefully orchestrated murder. Miss Marple had positioned herself in the morning room with her knitting, where the natural ebb and flow of household activity would bring each suspect within range of her patient observation. She had learned through long experience that people revealed their truest nature in the small, unguarded moments between formal questioning, when they believed themselves safely beyond scrutiny. Physical evidence and revelations. Mrs. Greeley's discovery in the morning sweepings provided the first concrete evidence of deliberate tampering. The housekeeper approached Inspector Aberley with obvious reluctance, carrying a small dustpan containing the usual detritus of daily cleaning, breadcrumbs, a wayward pin, ordinary dust, and something far more significant. "I didn't think of it last night, sir," she confided, her large hands worrying the corner of her apron. "But when I swept by the garden table this morning, where the candles were set, I found these curls of blue wax under the leg nearest the door, like when you pare a candle to make it fit a smaller holder, if you take my meaning." Inspector Aberley examined the delicate shavings with growing interest. They were thin and even, created by a sharp blade wielded with considerable skill. The implications were immediately clear. Someone had modified one of the candles at the ceremony site itself, suggesting either remarkable boldness or intimate knowledge of when such work could be accomplished unobserved. Miss Marple studied the shavings with particular attention, noting their uniform thickness and the precision of their curl. "Such neat work," she observed mildly, "rather like peeling an apple in one continuous ribbon. It requires a steady hand and considerable practice with a blade." The discovery prompted Inspector Aberley to examine the brass candle holders more closely. The middle saucer, as Mrs. Greeley had mentioned, bore a small nick that would indeed require careful fitting of any candle placed within it. Someone had taken the time to ensure a perfect fit, suggesting preparation rather than hasty improvisation. The case against Jeremy intensifies. Jeremy Caldwell's position as the obvious suspect grew more precarious as the day progressed. Inspector Aberley's systematic questioning revealed a web of opportunity and apparent motive that seemed to point inexorably toward the young man's guilt. "Mr. Caldwell," the inspector began with characteristic directness, "we've discovered that Mrs. Thornfield modified her will 6 weeks ago. Did you know you were named as a beneficiary?" The shock on Jeremy's face appeared genuine, his pale features growing even more ashen. "That's impossible, Inspector. Mrs. Thornfield never mentioned any such arrangement to me." "What sort of provision?" £500 and the right to purchase her candle-making equipment at nominal cost. Hardly a fortune, but significant for someone in your position." Mrs. Ashford, who had been listening from the doorway with barely concealed interest, interjected sharply. £500? Lydia assured me she would honor Charles's wishes regarding household staff. This is most irregular. Jeremy's hands trembled as he absorbed this information. "Inspector, I swear I had no knowledge of any bequest." Mrs. Thornfield was generous with her time and teaching, but she never spoke of formal provisions. If such a will exists, it was prepared without my knowledge or encouragement. Miss Marple observed the young man's reaction with her customary attention to detail. His shock seemed genuine, but she had learned that even guilty parties could convince themselves of their innocence when faced with consequences they had not fully anticipated. More significant was the timing. 6 weeks ago would have coincided with Mrs. Thornfield's first complaints of anxiety and sleep disturbance. Mrs. Ashford's complicated timeline. The revelation of Mrs. Ashford's early arrival in the village provided another layer of complexity to the investigation. When confronted with Mrs. Blackwood's observation, she maintained her composure with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to managing uncomfortable truths. "Yes, I arrived earlier than I initially stated," she admitted with crisp precision. "I had business regarding certain family items that Lydia had misappropriated. I saw no need to broadcast my movements to the entire village." Inspector Aberley pressed for details. What sort of business, Mrs. Ashford? Charles's military medals, among other things. I discovered she had sold them to a collector in Bath without consulting the family. As his only surviving relative, I felt entitled to recover what remained of our heritage before it disappeared entirely. This admission cast Mrs. Thornfield's financial situation in an even more desperate light while providing Mrs. Ashford with both motive and opportunity. The early arrival allowed ample time for preparation, while her resentment over the sold medals suggested emotions that went far beyond simple family discord. Dr. Pembroke's uncomfortable knowledge. Dr. Pembroke's testimony revealed the most disturbing aspect of the case. The possibility that Mrs. Thornfield's death represented not a single act of murder, but the culmination of a prolonged campaign of systematic poisoning. Mrs. Thornfield consulted me several times over the past month about increasing anxiety and sleep disturbance. He confirmed reluctantly. She mentioned a particular scent in her still room, faint and sweet, almost sickly. She thought it might be a new herb she hadn't properly identified. And you believed this was related to her symptoms? I suggested she might be developing sensitivity to her materials, but she dismissed the possibility quite firmly. Looking back, I fear I should have investigated more thoroughly. Some organic compounds, when vaporized in small amounts, can produce exactly the symptoms she described. Miss Marple found this revelation particularly significant. If Mrs. Thornfield had been experiencing gradual poisoning over several weeks, it suggested a killer with both patience and access, someone who could repeatedly introduce toxic substances into her environment while maintaining an appearance of normalcy. The behavioral experiment. Inspector Aberley's decision to conduct a simple behavioral experiment proved remarkably illuminating. He arranged 3 harmless candles from the pantry in a row and asked each suspect to enter individually, say a few commemorative words, and light one candle of their choosing. The results were telling. Mrs. Blackwood chose the leftmost candle decisively, explaining that it was what one does. Reverend Hartley reached for the center almost without looking, the habit of someone accustomed to reading from the middle of a lectern. Dr. Pembroke selected the right-hand candle as the most convenient. Jeremy, pale and earnest, chose the center with obvious deliberation. Mrs. Ashford's performance was the most revealing. She entered with composed dignity, stood for a long moment as if in prayer, then reached toward the leftmost candle before shifting to the center with what appeared to be a theatrical sigh of emotion. The correction seemed too conscious, too deliberate, a performance rather than natural behavior. Miss Marple observed this display with particular interest. "It's curious," she murmured to Inspector Aberley afterward, "how some people choose instinctively while others seem to be following a script. Natural grief has its own patterns, quite different from performed sorrow. Technical evidence and professional knowledge. The laboratory's preliminary report confirmed the presence of an arsenical compound in the poisoned wick, volatilized by heat to create the deadly vapor that had killed Mrs. Thornfield so quickly. The sophistication of the delivery method suggested someone with considerable knowledge of chemistry and toxicology. More intriguingly, the knot securing the treated wick displayed professional skill, a double overhand with an extra securing turn that required either maritime training or considerable practice to execute properly. Jeremy's background as a clerk provided no such expertise, while both Dr. Pembroke's surgical training and Mrs. Ashford's upbringing in a naval family could account for such knowledge. The discovery of an empty arsenical weed-killer packet in the shrubbery behind the still-room window provided the likely source of the poison, though its convenient placement suggested either panic or deliberate misdirection. Miss Marple noted a small smudge of blue wax on one corner, evidence that whoever had discarded it had been handling candle materials. Growing complexity and doubt. As the investigation progressed, Miss Marple found herself increasingly skeptical of the obvious solution. Jeremy's guilt seemed almost too perfectly established. The access, the apparent motive, the nervous behavior that could be interpreted as consciousness of guilt. In her experience, real murderers were rarely so conveniently obvious. The timing of various discoveries troubled her as well. The modified will that provided Jeremy with motive, his proximity to all the evidence, even his emotional investment in Mrs. Thornfield's welfare, all these elements aligned too neatly with what an investigator would expect to find in a guilty party. More significantly, the sophistication of the murder method suggested someone far more calculating than the grief-stricken young man who sat trembling in the commander's study. The gradual poisoning, the careful preparation of the substitute wick, the psychological manipulation that ensured Mrs. Thornfield would choose the deadly candle, all pointed to a mind capable of long-term planning and ruthless execution. The pattern emerges as afternoon shadows lengthened across the garden where Mrs. Thornfield had met her end. Miss Marple began to see the outline of a far more complex crime than simple murder for gain. Someone had exploited the victim's own expertise and sentimental nature, turning her beloved craft into the instrument of her destruction. The killer had demonstrated intimate knowledge not only of candle-making techniques, but of Mrs. Thornfield's habits, fears, and emotional vulnerabilities. The choice of a memorial ceremony as the venue for murder showed particular psychological sophistication, a cruel irony that transformed an act of remembrance into an occasion of death. Someone had watched Mrs. Thornfield closely enough to predict her behavior with deadly accuracy, knowing she would instinctively choose the center candle when faced with 3 identical options. Inspector Aberley remained focused on Jeremy as the most likely suspect, and the evidence certainly supported such a conclusion. But Miss Marple had learned to distrust convenient solutions, particularly in cases where the method showed such elaborate understanding of human psychology. The very obviousness of Jeremy's guilt made her increasingly certain that the true culprit was someone far more cunning, someone whose hand remained invisible while others drew suspicion upon themselves. The investigation was far from over, but already the careful observer could see that this case would ultimately hinge not on forensic evidence or financial motives, but on the eternal verities of human nature that Miss Marple had spent a lifetime studying. Someone had lit the wrong candle with deadly precision, and the truth would eventually emerge from the shadows of Meadowbank House like candlelight piercing the darkness. The game, as she had learned to think of these tragic affairs, was becoming more intricate with each passing hour, and somewhere among this gathering of seemingly respectable villagers, a murderer was no doubt beginning to realize that their perfect crime might not prove quite as perfect as they had believed. The grey afternoon light filtering through the rain-streaked windows of Meadowbank House seemed to mirror the increasingly murky nature of the investigation, as Inspector Aberley found himself confronting evidence that pointed in multiple directions simultaneously. Miss Marple, maintaining her quiet vigil in the morning room, observed each new development with the patient attention of someone who understood that truth often emerged not from the loudest accusations, but from the smallest inconsistencies carefully examined. Disturbing physical evidence. Mrs. Greeley's methodical cleaning had yielded several discoveries that transformed the investigation's focus from simple murder to sophisticated deception. The delicate curls of blue wax found beneath the garden table leg told a story of careful modification performed at the ceremony site itself. Someone had pared down a candle to ensure a perfect fit in the slightly damaged brass holder. Such precise work, Miss Marple observed, examining the uniform shavings with her magnifying glass. Rather like peeling an apple in one continuous ribbon. It requires not only a steady hand, but considerable practice with a sharp blade. More significantly, Mrs. Greeley had discovered a small glass vial concealed behind the lavender jar on the still room's 3rd shelf. The vial contained traces of a clear, oily substance with a faintly sweet aroma, and bore a paper label written in cramped, hurried handwriting. T.W., 3 drops per wick. Evening applications only. Inspector Aberley's examination revealed that the handwriting was decidedly masculine, with characteristics suggesting either medical training or considerable education. When confronted with the vial, Dr. Pembroke's professional composure showed significant strain. "This appears to be a concentrated tincture of some sort," he admitted reluctantly. "The base is clearly alcoholic, but there are other compounds present that would require proper laboratory analysis to identify." The discovery of a dark blue thread snagged on a nail near the bottom shelf, matching Mrs. Thornfield's favorite dressing gown, suggested she had been working in the still room recently. Combined with the vial evidence, it painted a disturbing picture of gradual poisoning that had been occurring over weeks. The two-stage poisoning theory. Jeremy's revelation about Mrs. Thornfield's recent sleep difficulties provided the key to understanding the vial's true significance. She had been experiencing increasing anxiety and sleep disturbance for several weeks, he confirmed quietly. She mentioned it affected her work. Small errors in measurements, forgetting familiar processes. She was quite distressed. Dr. Pembroke's uncomfortable admission that Mrs. Thornfield had specifically asked about substances that might cause anxiety when burned or inhaled suggested she had begun to suspect she was being systematically poisoned. Her symptoms, worse in the evenings, particularly when working in her still room, indicated a pattern of exposure that went far beyond yesterday's fatal ceremony. The symptoms she described were consistent with low-level arsenical exposure, Dr. Pembroke finally admitted. If someone had been introducing small amounts of volatile compounds into her environment over time, it would explain the gradual onset of anxiety, sleep disturbance, and impaired judgment. Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing certainty about the killer's sophisticated method. "How cruel," she murmured, "to poison someone slowly, clouding their judgment and weakening their defenses, only to deliver the final blow when they were most vulnerable and least able to protect themselves." Technical sophistication and professional knowledge. The laboratory's detailed analysis of the poisoned wick revealed the true complexity of the murder method. The arsenical compound had been introduced through multiple applications over several days, with the wick removed from a completed candle, treated with poison, then carefully reinserted. The process required not only chemical knowledge, but considerable patience and skill. Microscopic examination showed traces of blue wax embedded in the fibers, evidence that the killer had dismantled one of Mrs. Thornfield's finished candles, modified the wick, then reconstructed the candle with sufficient expertise to disguise the tampering. Such work demanded intimate knowledge of candle-making techniques combined with access to both materials and workspace. The discovery that 2 additional candles had been returned to the still-room parcel, bringing the count to 35 instead of the expected 33, confirmed that substitution had occurred. Someone had removed the genuine memorial candle, replaced it with the poisoned version, then returned both the original and a second substitute to maintain the appearance of normalcy. Revelations about access and opportunity. Reverend Hartley's casual admission that he had borrowed Mrs. Thornfield's candle molds the previous winter provided another layer of complexity. "We made quite a chaos with the children," he confirmed pleasantly. "Beeswax everywhere. I cleaned the molds as best I could and returned them within the week." Mrs. Greeley's memory of the transaction was more detailed. The Reverend's man came with a message, and Mrs. Thornfield gave him a small parcel through the window. She said it was easier than going all the way round, what with the cold. Miss Marple noted the significance of this detail, the still-room window that provided access without requiring the key that never left Mrs. Thornfield's person. Someone familiar with the household's routines could have gained entry through careful timing and knowledge of when the room would be unoccupied. Mrs. Ashford's complicated timeline. Mrs. Ashford's admission that she had arrived hours earlier than claimed cast her movements in a far more suspicious light. Her confrontation with Mrs. Thornfield about the sold medals had been more serious than initially suggested. She had threatened legal action to recover family items she believed were being systematically disposed of. I discovered that Lydia was facing genuine financial pressure, Mrs. Ashford revealed with obvious reluctance. The candle-making business was profitable, but not sufficient to maintain her lifestyle. She had been systematically selling family heirlooms, including Charles military medals, to collectors. The telegram from Bath confirming the medal sale revealed another disturbing detail. The authorization letter bore initials LT rather than Mrs. Thornfield's usual full signature. Jeremy's production of a draft circular in her handwriting showed the clear difference. She never put initials as signature. She wrote her name out fully, Lydia, always. She said initials were for men in committee minutes. The London contract deception. Inspector Aberley's investigation into the mysterious London firm revealed a web of conflicting information that suggested deliberate deception. While Jeremy believed Mrs. Thornfield was on the verge of signing a lucrative exclusive contract, the firm's actual representative had found concerning variations in technique that suggested either declining skills or external interference. The timing of this evaluation, occurring just as Mrs. Thornfield was experiencing symptoms of gradual poisoning, was particularly significant. If her abilities were indeed declining due to systematic poisoning, the failed London opportunity would have represented not salvation, but the collapse of her only reliable income source. The mysterious gentleman caller, described by the gardener as having clever hands, now seemed far more sinister. Someone had gained Mrs. Thornfield's confidence while simultaneously undermining her professional reputation and psychological stability. Miss Marple's growing certainty. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that Jeremy Caldwell was being systematically framed by someone far more cunning. The evidence against him was almost too perfectly arranged. The access, the apparent motive from the modified will, the nervous behavior that could be interpreted as guilt. The killer has demonstrated intimate knowledge not only of Mrs. Thornfield's habits and fears, she reflected quietly to Inspector Aberley, but of how a police investigation would likely proceed. Someone has been very careful to ensure that suspicion would fall on the most obvious candidate while they remained safely in the shadows. The sophistication of the murder method troubled her most deeply. The gradual poisoning that weakened Mrs. Thornfield's resistance, the careful preparation of the substitute wick, the psychological manipulation that ensured she would choose the deadly candle, all pointed to a mind capable of long-term planning and ruthless calculation. More tellingly, the killer had taken genuine pleasure in the elaborate nature of the deception. A simple poisoning would have been far more straightforward. Instead, they had chosen to create an elaborate psychological trap that turned Mrs. Thornfield's own expertise and sentimental nature against her, a level of cruel sophistication that suggested deep personal resentment rather than mere financial motive. The pattern emerges. The accumulating evidence painted a portrait of a killer who possessed several distinct characteristics: medical or chemical knowledge sufficient for sophisticated poisoning, intimate understanding of Mrs. Thornfield's psychological vulnerabilities gained through sustained contact, and the emotional detachment necessary to orchestrate months of gradual torture before delivering the final blow. Most significantly, this person had demonstrated the ability to manipulate not only their victim, but the entire investigative process, creating false evidence and misdirection while maintaining an appearance of respectability and concern. As Inspector Aberley prepared to make what appeared to be the obvious arrest, Miss Marple settled back with her knitting, confident that the truth would eventually emerge from the tangle of motives, opportunities, and carefully constructed deceptions. In her experience, murderers who believed themselves supremely clever often proved to be their own undoing, betrayed by the very attention to detail that made their crimes seem perfect. The game was indeed becoming more intricate with each revelation, and somewhere among this gathering of seemingly respectable villagers, a killer was no doubt beginning to realize that their perfect crime might not prove quite as perfect as they had believed. The web of deception was complex, but Miss Marple had learned that even the most elaborate lies eventually unraveled when subjected to patient observation and an understanding of fundamental human nature. The late afternoon brought a shift in the investigation's momentum as Inspector Aberley prepared to arrest Jeremy Caldwell, the accumulation of circumstantial evidence having reached what he considered sufficient weight for prosecution. The young man sat pale and trembling in the commander's study, while outside the persistent drizzle had transformed Meadowbank House into something resembling a melancholy watercolor, with mist clinging to the yew hedges and pearling the windows like tears. Miss Marple, observing from her corner chair with her knitting temporarily forgotten, felt the familiar unease that had served her well in previous encounters with seemingly obvious solutions. She had learned to distrust convenient answers, particularly in cases where the method showed such elaborate understanding of human psychology. "Mr. Caldwell," Inspector Aberley began with official gravity, his notebook open to a page filled with damning details. "I must ask you to accompany me to the station for formal questioning regarding the death of Mrs. Lydia Thornfield. The evidence suggests—" "Inspector," Miss Marple interrupted gently, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded attention in previous investigations. "If I might suggest a brief delay. There are several small matters that continue to trouble me about this case, details that seem to point in directions we haven't fully explored." Inspector Aberley paused, his respect for Miss Marple's previous insights warring with his professional obligation to proceed with what appeared to be a clear case. The pressure from his superiors for a swift resolution made delay increasingly difficult to justify, yet something in her tone gave him pause. "What sort of details, Miss Marple?" She produced a sample of Jeremy's handwriting from a shopping list Mrs. Greeley had provided, comparing it to the cramped notation on the mysterious vial. "The handwriting on that vial, for instance. You mentioned it appeared masculine and educated, possibly medical. Yet Mr. Caldwell's writing samples show a distinctly different character, more commercial clerk than professional man." The differences were immediately apparent to anyone who cared to look closely. Jeremy's script was rounded and flowing, the hand of someone accustomed to copying correspondence and maintaining ledgers. The vial's label showed angular precision, with a particular economy of line that spoke of someone trained to write prescriptions or technical notes under pressure. "More significantly," Miss Marple continued, her pale blue eyes surveying the assembled suspects, "the timing of the gradual poisoning suggests someone with considerable patience and long-term access. Mr. Caldwell, being so obviously devoted to Mrs. Thornfield's welfare, would hardly have spent weeks making her miserable before killing her. Such behavior seems more consistent with someone who derived genuine satisfaction from her suffering." Dr. Pembroke shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands moving restlessly before settling in his lap with obvious effort. Mrs. Ashford maintained her composed facade, though her knuckles showed white where they gripped her handbag. Even Reverend Hartley's usual pleasant demeanor seemed slightly strained, his pianist's fingers drumming silently against his knee. The psychological profile. Miss Marple's analysis cut to the heart of what made this murder so particularly cruel. "Consider the elaborate nature of the final death, Inspector. A simple poisoning would have been far more straightforward. Instead, our killer chose to create a theatrical murder that turned Mrs. Thornfield's own expertise and sentimental nature against her. Such cruelty suggests deep personal resentment rather than mere financial motive." She gestured toward the garden where the memorial ceremony had taken place. "Someone orchestrated a months-long campaign designed not only to kill Mrs. Thornfield, but to destroy her reputation, her business, and her peace of mind before delivering the final blow. They turned each of her vulnerabilities against her with cruel precision: her financial fears, her devotion to her craft, her love for her late husband's memory." Jeremy's obvious shock at this description appeared genuine, his face reflecting horror at the systematic nature of the torture that had been inflicted on his employer. "That's monstrous," he whispered. Who could do such a thing? Someone with intimate knowledge of her psychological vulnerabilities, Miss Marple replied quietly. Someone who had gained her complete trust, who could observe her habits closely enough to predict her behavior with deadly accuracy. Someone who possessed both the technical knowledge for sophisticated poisoning and the emotional detachment necessary to watch her suffer for weeks. Evidence of systematic sabotage. Inspector Aberley's re-examination of the remaining candles in the still-room parcel had revealed disturbing evidence that supported Miss Marple's theory. Several of these candles show variations in weight and composition, he announced. Someone has been systematically replacing Mrs. Thornfield's work with inferior substitutes. This discovery cast the failed London contract in an entirely different light. If Mrs. Thornfield's candles were being systematically replaced with substandard versions, the concerning variations in technique noted by the London evaluator would have been deliberate sabotage rather than declining skills brought on by anxiety and illness. The killer wasn't content with simple murder, Miss Marple observed. They wanted to destroy her professionally as well, to ensure that even if she survived the poisoning, her livelihood would be ruined. It's a level of vindictive thoroughness that speaks to very personal motivation. Mrs. Ashford's defensive reaction to this revelation provided the first significant crack in her composed facade. If someone was indeed undermining Lydia's business, she said with forced calm, it might have been motivated by concern for the family reputation. Her increasingly erratic behavior reflected poorly on Charles's memory. The admission revealed far more active involvement in Mrs. Thornfield's affairs than previously acknowledged. Her knowledge of the business details, her access through early arrival, and her obvious resentment over the sold medals provided both motive and opportunity for systematic sabotage. Technical evidence and professional knowledge. Dr. Pembroke found himself drawn into the discussion despite his obvious discomfort. When Miss Marple inquired innocently about the properties of various toxic compounds, he spoke with the detached precision of his medical training. The symptoms Mrs. Thornfield described were indeed consistent with systematic low-level poisoning, he admitted reluctantly. Certain compounds, when vaporized in small amounts over time, can produce exactly the anxiety and sleep disturbance she experienced. The method would require precise knowledge of dosage and delivery. The line between chronic exposure and acute poisoning is quite narrow. His hands, Miss Marple noted, showed the slight tremor that appeared only when no patient was present to steady his professional demeanor. More significantly, his signet ring, heavy gold with an engraved medical caduceus, matched the gardener's description of the mysterious caller's jewelry. The TW notation on the vial troubles me as well, Miss Marple continued. Initially, one might assume it referred to Thornfield widow, suggesting Mrs. Thornfield had labeled her own poison. But the handwriting is decidedly masculine, and the phrasing suggests instructions rather than identification. Reverend Hartley, who had been listening with his customary pleasant attention, offered a gentle observation. In my experience with church records, such abbreviated notations often represent technical instructions rather than personal identification. 3 drops per wick, evening applications only, suggests someone following a systematic protocol. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the slight stiffening of his fingers as he spoke, hands that showed the calluses of someone accustomed to detailed manual work. The clever hands described by the gardener could easily apply to a man trained in both delicate ecclesiastical duties and the precise knot work required for his naval chaplaincy service. The pattern of access. The mystery of how someone had gained repeated access to the locked still room began to resolve as Miss Marple pieced together the household routines. Mrs. Thornfield's habit of airing out the room after evening work sessions, leaving the window slightly open for temperature control, provided the perfect opportunity for someone familiar with her schedule. The window that provided such convenient access for borrowing candle molds, Miss Marple observed mildly. Someone who knew about That arrangement would understand exactly when the room might be briefly accessible without requiring the key that never left Mrs. Thornfield's person. The implications were clear to everyone present. Both Reverend Hartley, who had used the window for his transaction, and Dr. Pembroke, who had made evening house calls to discuss Mrs. Thornfield's anxiety, possessed the knowledge and opportunity for systematic interference with her work. Growing certainty. As the investigation progressed, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that Jeremy Caldwell was being systematically framed by someone far more cunning. The evidence against him was almost too perfectly arranged: the access, the apparent motive from the modified will, the nervous behavior that could be interpreted as consciousness of guilt. The killer has demonstrated intimate knowledge not only of Mrs. Thornfield's habits and fears, she reflected to Inspector Aberley, but of how a police investigation would likely proceed. Someone has been very careful to ensure that suspicion would fall on the most obvious candidate while they remained safely in the shadows. The sophistication of the murder method troubled her most deeply. The gradual poisoning that weakened Mrs. Thornfield's resistance, the careful preparation of the substitute wick, the psychological manipulation that ensured she would choose the deadly candle, all pointed to a mind capable of long-term planning and ruthless calculation. Inspector Aberley found himself increasingly uncertain about proceeding with Jeremy's arrest. The young man's obvious devotion to Mrs. Thornfield, combined with the growing evidence of sophisticated long-term planning, suggested a killer far more calculating than the grief-stricken secretary who sat trembling in the commander's study. As evening shadows lengthened across the garden where Mrs. Thornfield had met her end, the investigation stood at a crucial juncture. The obvious solution beckoned with its apparent completeness, but Miss Marple's experience had taught her to distrust convenient answers, particularly in cases where the method showed such elaborate understanding of human psychology. The game was indeed becoming more complex with each revelation, and somewhere among this gathering of seemingly respectable villagers, a murderer was no doubt beginning to realize that their perfect crime might not prove quite as perfect as they had believed. The web of deception was intricate, but Miss Marple had learned that even the most elaborate lies eventually unraveled when subjected to patient observation and an understanding of the eternal verities of human nature. The truth would emerge, as it always did, but first they would need to look beyond the obvious to find the hand that had remained hidden while others drew suspicion upon themselves. As evening settled over Meadowbank House, Inspector Aberley found himself reconsidering the investigation's direction based on Miss Marple's quiet but persistent observations. The accumulation of evidence against Jeremy Caldwell remained compelling, yet something about the case's very convenience troubled him. At Miss Marple's gentle suggestion, he decided to maintain surveillance on the still room through the night, sensing that the killer's confidence might lead them to make a crucial error. The still room trap, Constable Row, was positioned discreetly in the shrubbery with instructions to observe the still room window, while a strip of paper was pasted across the window frame to detect any interference. Inside, the room was left precisely as it had been since the morning's examination. The workbench tidy, the parcel of blue candles counted and secured, everything appearing undisturbed to casual observation. Miss Marple had suggested this approach based on her understanding of human nature. When someone has placed so many careful stones in their wall of deception, she had observed mildly, they become very reluctant to leave even one pebble out of alignment. If there are other prepared candles in the house, our killer will feel compelled to remove them before they can be discovered. Her intuition proved correct, though not in the manner anyone expected. At 9:30, Mrs. Greeley made a discovery that transformed their understanding of the case entirely. While conducting her evening rounds, she had noticed something amiss in the library. One of the blue candles that had been placed decoratively on the mantelpiece showed signs of recent handling, with fingerprints visible on its waxy surface. More significantly, when Inspector Aberley examined the candle with his magnifying glass, he detected the same faint, sickly sweet aroma that had characterized the poisoned wick from the memorial ceremony. The killer had not prepared just one deadly candle, but several. A systematic poisoning campaign with multiple instruments of death positioned throughout the house. Hidden correspondence. The true breakthrough came when Mrs. Greeley, emboldened by the evening's discoveries, mentioned that Mrs. Thornfield had asked her to clear out the commander's old sea chest for the church jumble sale. "She was most particular about it, sir," the housekeeper explained. "Said there might be important papers that needed proper sorting before anything went to charity." Hidden beneath a false bottom, wrapped in oilcloth against dampness, they discovered a leather portfolio containing correspondence that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy against Mrs. Thornfield. The letters, written in her familiar hand, documented weeks of growing suspicion and fear as she gradually realized someone was systematically destroying her life's work. The most significant letter, dated just 5 days before her death, read, "I have confirmed that someone has been accessing my still room through the service passage, using Mrs. Greeley's convenient latch arrangement. They have been replacing my carefully prepared candles with inferior copies, introducing toxic substances into my workspace, and systematically undermining my reputation with the London firm. I believe I know who has been orchestrating this campaign, and tomorrow I will confront them directly." Miss Marple studied the correspondence with particular attention to the psychological profile it revealed. She was not a woman driven to desperation by financial pressure, she observed quietly. She was a victim fighting back against someone who had been torturing her for months, someone who derived genuine pleasure from watching her suffer while maintaining an appearance of concern and respectability. Dr. Pembroke's confession. The discovery of the correspondence prompted Inspector Aberley to confront Dr. Pembroke more directly about his role in Mrs. Thornfield's declining health. The doctor's composure finally cracked when presented with evidence of the systematic poisoning campaign, his medical training making it impossible for him to deny the symptoms he had observed and documented. "I never intended to harm her," he confessed, his hands trembling as he spoke. She had been experiencing severe anxiety, becoming increasingly difficult and demanding. I thought a mild sedative, administered subtly through her candle-making materials, might calm her nerves and make her more amenable to proper medical treatment. His confession revealed the TW notation on the vial, tincture, weak, representing his misguided attempt to treat Mrs. Thornfield's anxiety without her knowledge. He had introduced a diluted arsenical compound into her wick preparations, believing it would produce a calming effect when burned in small quantities. "But I swear I had nothing to do with the memorial ceremony murder," he insisted desperately. "I was as shocked as anyone when she collapsed. My treatments were meant to help, not kill." Miss Marple listened to this confession with the patient attention of someone who understood that truth often emerged in layers. Dr. Pembroke's actions explained the gradual poisoning and Mrs. Thornfield's declining health, but they did not account for the sophisticated planning and cruel precision of the final murder. The systematic sabotage. The investigation into Mrs. Thornfield's business affairs revealed the true scope of the campaign against her. The London firm's detailed report showed that someone had been systematically replacing her high-quality candles with inferior copies, ensuring that her reputation would suffer while maintaining access to her techniques and materials. The sabotage was remarkably sophisticated, Inspector Aberley noted as he reviewed the evidence. Someone with intimate knowledge of her methods had been creating flawed copies of her work. Candles that appeared correct but burned poorly, produced excessive smoke, or contained inferior materials that would reflect badly on her craftsmanship. More disturbing still was the discovery that Mrs. Thornfield had been aware of this sabotage and had been methodically documenting the evidence. Her private notes revealed a systematic investigation into the discrepancies in her work, the timing of her symptoms, and the correlation between her evening work sessions and her declining health. Jeremy's reaction to these revelations was one of genuine horror and disbelief. "She never mentioned any of this to me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I had known someone was deliberately undermining her work, I would have done everything in my power to help her expose them. Physical evidence and professional knowledge." The accumulation of physical evidence painted a picture of someone with considerable technical knowledge and regular access to Mrs. Thornfield's workspace. The waxy bloom on clothing, the precise knot-work used to secure the poisoned wick, and the sophisticated understanding of candle-making techniques all pointed to someone who had spent considerable time studying and copying her methods. Miss Marple observed the reactions of each suspect as this evidence was presented, noting the subtle signs that revealed which individuals possessed knowledge they had not acknowledged. The killer's expertise went far beyond casual observation. It represented months of careful study and practice, combined with the patience necessary to execute such an elaborate deception. The pattern emerges. As the investigation progressed through the evening, Miss Marple began to see the complete outline of a crime that was far more sophisticated than simple murder for gain. Someone had exploited Dr. Pembroke's misguided medical intervention, using his gradual poisoning as cover for a much more elaborate campaign of psychological torture and professional destruction. The killer had demonstrated not only technical knowledge and regular access, but also the psychological insight necessary to predict Mrs. Thornfield's behavior with deadly accuracy. They had known she would choose the center candle when faced with 3 identical options, had understood her sentimental attachment to memorial ceremonies, and had counted on her emotional state to override her usual caution. Most significantly, this person had maintained an appearance of concern and respectability throughout Mrs. Thornfield's decline, offering comfort and support while secretly orchestrating her destruction. The level of cruel sophistication suggested someone who had taken genuine pleasure in the elaborate nature of their deception, someone who viewed the murder not as a necessary evil, but as the culmination of a masterfully executed psychological campaign. Growing certainty, Inspector Aberley found himself facing a case far more complex than he had initially suspected. Dr. Pembroke's confession had provided crucial insight into the gradual poisoning, but it had also revealed him as an unwitting tool in a larger conspiracy, rather than the mastermind behind the elaborate murder plot. Miss Marple settled back with her, knitting as the evening's revelations were absorbed and analyzed, confident that the truth was finally beginning to emerge from the shadows of Meadowbank House. The killer had been performing brilliantly throughout the investigation, maintaining their facade of respectability while others drew suspicion upon themselves. But even the most accomplished actors, she had learned, eventually betrayed themselves through the very attention to detail that made their deception seem perfect. The game was nearing its climax, and soon the true architect of Lydia Thornfield's destruction would be forced to step forward from the shadows they had so carefully maintained. The web of deception was complex and cruel, but Miss Marple had spent a lifetime studying the eternal verities of human nature that lay beneath such elaborate facades. Someone had lit the wrong candle with deadly precision, and the truth would soon illuminate the darkness that had consumed Meadowbank House like candlelight piercing the gloom. The household retired early that evening, more from exhaustion than any hope of peaceful rest, and Inspector Aberley, acting upon Miss Marple's quiet counsel, made a deliberately casual announcement before the group dispersed. He mentioned, quite off-handedly, that Mrs. Thornfield's hidden correspondence contained sufficient detail to identify the hand behind the systematic sabotage, and that he would be consulting with London specialists first thing in the morning. The statement was delivered with the kind of simple assurance that implied finality, and Miss Marple, who understood precisely how certain minds reacted to the prospect of imminent exposure, watched the faces in the room rather than the inspector himself. Dr. Pembroke's gaze dropped immediately to his hands, as if seeking counsel from instruments that had served him better than his conscience. Mrs. Ashford's lips tightened with what appeared to be impatience rather than fear. the reaction of someone accustomed to managing unpleasant situations through sheer force of will. Reverend Hartley murmured something appropriately sympathetic about hoping the truth would bring comfort to the grieving, though his pianist's fingers had ceased their unconscious tapping against his knee. Jeremy, poor young man, looked only bewildered by the suggestion that such elaborate deception had been unfolding around him. The autumn rain began in earnest after 10 o'clock, a determined downpour that masked small sounds while making innocent movements seem suspicious. Constable Rowe took his position near the still-room window with the strip of paper carefully aligned across the frame, while Inspector Aberley maintained watch on the main corridors of the house. Miss Marple, who had accepted a guest room on the first floor, did not attempt sleep. Instead, she sat by her window with a shawl drawn close, listening to the familiar dialogue of old houses in wet weather, downpipes clearing their throats, timber settling into comfortable positions, the occasional complaint of a door disturbed by drafts. At 11:30, she heard the soft, careful footstep of someone moving along the landing with a particular stealth that spoke of long familiarity with household routines. The sound carried the practiced quiet of someone accustomed to moving through parsonages or sick rooms, places where disturbing others was considered a serious breach of propriety. What followed was oddly methodical. The soft scrape of a drawer being opened, the muffled displacement and careful replacement of books, brief pauses that suggested consultation of some mental inventory. The footsteps retreated, then returned with increased confidence, and Miss Marple reflected that it was rather like watching someone search their own desk, only in darkness and wearing gloves. When the hall clock struck midnight, a subdued exclamation of frustration carried clearly through the quiet house, followed by slightly quickened steps. She allowed herself a small nod of satisfaction. People who believed themselves supremely clever often became quite vexed when thwarted by simple prudence, such as replacing an important portfolio with a bundle of parish circulars and an unflattering photograph from the summer garden fete. Downstairs, Constable Rowe witnessed a more direct drama. The paper strip across the still-room window quivered, then parted with surgical precision, suggesting a practiced hand familiar with such work. The lower sash rose no more than an inch, then another, and a thin blade, the sort used for lifting stuck wax from molds, slid through the opening. Rowe moved with commendable silence for a man of his substantial build, but his hand closed on nothing more than a damp sleeve that slipped away like water. The intruder vanished into the rain with the speed of someone who knew the grounds intimately, leaving behind only the faint scent of bay and something sweeter. The failed intrusion, nevertheless, provided valuable evidence. On the inner sill, Inspector Aberley discovered a thin shaving the color of deep sea water, faintly scented with rosemary, but tainted by the unnatural sweetness they had learned to recognize. A smear on the window sash showed the particular bloom that beeswax leaves on dark wool, the sort of mark that appears on vestments after changing altar candles, as Miss Marple observed with gentle precision. The library search had proved equally unsuccessful for the intruder, though equally informative for the investigators. The decoy bundle lay disturbed on the desk, its twine loosened with a deftness that spoke volumes about the searcher's capabilities. The knot had been turned under with remarkable economy of movement, the sort of impeccable work that was quite unnecessary for simple string, but revealed habits ingrained through years of practice. When the house was fully roused and proper lighting restored, Inspector Aberley telephoned the bath collector at Miss Marple's suggestion. The gentleman proved most helpful, though his information cast the medal transaction in an entirely different light. Mrs. Thornfield had not conducted the business personally, he confirmed. Instead, a gentleman had delivered the items with appropriate documentation, someone with what the collector described as a clerical sort of manner, and a way with his hands that bespoke delicacy. The description troubled Inspector Aberley, particularly when combined with the evening's discoveries. A tall man of middle years, careful in speech, cordial but not forthcoming, who carried a remarkably sharp knife for opening packages and insisted that nothing be altered from its original condition. The profile fitted uncomfortably well with more than one member of their small group of suspects. As dawn broke grey and watery over Meadowbank House, Miss Marple found herself in the morning room with Reverend Hartley, who sat reading the daily paper with less attention than his position suggested. His usual gentle demeanor showed subtle signs of strain, a tension around his eyes that spoke of sleepless hours and growing pressure. "It is truly dreadful business, Miss Marple," he said, breaking the comfortable silence with his characteristically soft voice. "To think such wickedness could take root in our peaceful village. One struggles to reconcile it with the goodness one hopes to see in people." "Indeed, Reverend," Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. "Human nature is such a complex tapestry, isn't it? Woven with threads both bright and dark. Sometimes the darkest threads are integrated so skillfully into patterns of respectability that they become nearly impossible to detect, until some sudden tear reveals the true nature of the weave." She paused, looking up from her work with an expression of gentle thoughtfulness. "I was just considering Mrs. Thornfield's approach to her craft. Such meticulous attention to detail, everything arranged with perfect precision. Some people, you know, find such methodical perfection rather trying. They prefer a more natural sort of disorder, perhaps." The newspaper crackled slightly as Reverend Hartley's grip tightened almost imperceptibly. "Order is certainly a virtue, Miss Marple, particularly in creative endeavors. Excellence requires discipline, as Mrs. Thornfield clearly understood." "Oh, she did indeed," Miss Marple agreed readily. "But sometimes a person's greatest strengths become their vulnerabilities. Her confidence in her own judgment, for instance. When faced with 3 identical candles, she would simply reach for the one that seemed most appropriate, trusting her instincts completely. Others might hesitate, might even verify their choice. But Mrs. Thornfield was a woman who trusted her senses implicitly." She observed him carefully, noting the fleeting expression that passed through his eyes before settling back into practiced calm. "It's fascinating how we fall into such predictable patterns, isn't it? The way one always selects the middle sweet from a box, or the central bloom from an arrangement. Even in our deepest emotional moments, we remain creatures of habit, and a perceptive person, studying those habits carefully, could predict our actions with remarkable accuracy, even to the point of knowing precisely which memorial candle we might choose in a moment of grief." Reverend Hartley cleared his throat softly. "That seems rather fatalistic, Miss Marple. Surely free will plays its part in human behavior." "Certainly, Reverend, but habits are powerful forces, particularly when combined with genuine artistic sensibility. Someone who understands delicate balance, precise placement, the subtle arrangements that make one choice seem more natural than another." Her gaze rested briefly on his hands, those long, capable fingers now perfectly still against his knees. "Someone with truly clever hands, as our gardener so aptly described." The faintest tremor passed through the Reverend's fingers, and he shifted slightly in his chair. His eyes, which had been meeting hers steadily, now sought the window, then returned to his newspaper, as if searching for escape from her gentle but inexorable observations. The tension around his features deepened, and a subtle flush colored his normally composed countenance. Miss Marple continued her knitting with serene concentration, a small, knowing expression playing about her lips. The psychological pressure was building precisely as she had intended, and the critical reaction, though carefully controlled, had been duly noted. The threads of deception were beginning to unravel under patient examination, revealing the true pattern that had been so skillfully concealed beneath layers of respectability and charitable concern. The game was indeed approaching its decisive moment, and someone would soon be compelled to abandon the careful performance they had maintained throughout the investigation. The truth, as Miss Marple had learned through long experience, had a way of emerging when subjected to the right combination of evidence and understanding of fundamental human nature. The grey morning light filtering through the rain-streaked windows seemed to mirror the increasingly sombre atmosphere at Meadowbank House, where the investigation had reached a critical juncture. Miss Marple, maintaining her quiet vigil in the morning room, observed Reverend Hartley with the patient attention of someone who understood that truth often emerged not through dramatic confrontation, but through the gentle pressure of accumulated observation. Inspector Aberley entered, carrying a small wooden box that Miss Marple recognized from Mrs. Thornfield's workbench, its contents now transformed from innocent tools into evidence of systematic deception. The inspector's manner carried a new certainty, the confidence of a man who had finally assembled the scattered pieces of an elaborate puzzle. "Reverend Hartley," Inspector Aberley began with characteristic directness, "I believe we need to discuss several discoveries that cast your involvement in this matter in a rather different light." The newspaper in Reverend Hartley's hands rustled slightly as he set it aside with deliberate care, his movements betraying none of the tension that Miss Marple could observe building behind his composed facade. "Of course, Inspector. I remain entirely at your service, though I confess uncertainty about what additional assistance I might provide." Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm as she watched the subtle interplay of gesture and expression that would soon reveal the truth behind Lydia Thornfield's elaborate murder. She had learned through long experience that even the most accomplished performers eventually betrayed themselves through the very attention to detail that made their deception seem perfect. The systematic presentation of evidence. Inspector Aberley opened the wooden box with deliberate ceremony, revealing an assortment of candle-making tools that had been cleaned and arranged with surgical precision. Among them lay a thin blade bearing traces of blue wax, and a small vial containing the clear, sweet-scented liquid they had learned to recognize as the instrument of Mrs. Thornfield's gradual poisoning. "These items were discovered concealed in the vestry of St. Michael's," the inspector announced quietly. "Hidden behind the communion silver, wrapped in oilcloth with the care one might expect from someone familiar with preserving valuable items against dampness. The blade shows clear evidence of having been used to modify candle wicks, while the vial contains a concentrated arsenical tincture matching the substance that killed Mrs. Thornfield." Reverend Hartley's hands, those remarkably steady instruments that had served him so well throughout his clerical career, now showed the faintest tremor as he clasped them in his lap. "I'm afraid I cannot account for how such items might have found their way into the church. The vestry is not always secure during daylight hours. Anyone familiar with our routines might have used it for concealment." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with an expression of mild curiosity. "How distressing that someone would choose such a sacred space for hiding evidence of murder. It suggests either remarkable desperation or considerable familiarity with the location. Someone who could move about the vestry without attracting attention or comment." The psychological pressure was building with characteristic subtlety, each observation adding weight to the accumulating evidence while maintaining the gentle, conversational tone that made Miss Marple's methods so devastatingly effective. Technical evidence and professional knowledge. "The handwriting analysis has confirmed our suspicions about the poison vial's notation," Inspector Aberley continued methodically. "The TW marking was written by someone with clerical training, the particular formation of letters, the economy of line, the abbreviated style, all consistent with someone accustomed to making precise notes under pressure. Church records, perhaps, or annotations during pastoral visits." Reverend Hartley's composure showed increasing strain, small beads of perspiration appearing despite the morning's chill. His breathing had altered in a way that only someone experienced in observing human distress would notice, the subtle changes that preceded either confession or desperate flight. Moreover, the inspector pressed on relentlessly, "The Bath collector has provided a detailed description of the gentleman who delivered Commander Thornfield's medals. A tall man of clerical bearing, with what he described as remarkably steady hands and intimate knowledge of military decorations. He was particularly impressed by the visitor's ability to identify the precise campaigns represented by each medal. This revelation struck with particular force, demonstrating knowledge that went far beyond casual acquaintance with the commander's service record. Someone had studied those medals with the thoroughness of a scholar, understanding not only their monetary value, but their historical significance, the kind of detailed knowledge that might emerge from years of pastoral conversations with a proud naval officer. Miss Marple's gentle interrogation. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and fixed Reverend Hartley with a gaze that had lost its gentle quality, revealing the sharp intelligence that had solved numerous village mysteries through patient observation and understanding of human nature. "You know, Reverend," she began in her characteristic manner, "I've been reflecting on the peculiar cruelty of this crime. Someone didn't simply want Mrs. Thornfield dead. They wanted her to suffer, to doubt herself, to watch her life's work crumble before her eyes. Such elaborate psychological torture suggests very personal motivation, doesn't it?" She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle before continuing with devastating precision. "It reminds me of certain biblical accounts of persecution, where the true suffering lay not in the final punishment, but in the slow destruction of everything the victim held dear. A methodical dismantling of a person's entire world, carried out with the patience one might expect from someone trained in, shall we say, the long view of human suffering." The reference to biblical persecution struck home with remarkable accuracy. Reverend Hartley's carefully maintained facade finally showed significant cracks, revealing glimpses of the cold calculation that had driven months of systematic torture disguised as pastoral concern. The psychological trap. "The knot work troubles me particularly," Miss Marple continued with apparent innocence. "That poisoned wick was secured with such precision, a double overhand with an extra turn, executed with the confidence that comes from considerable practice. My great-nephew's scout troop is always working on such things, but this showed professional competence. Rather like the work one might expect from someone with naval training, perhaps a chaplain who had served aboard ship." Reverend Hartley's grip on his chair arms tightened visibly, his knuckles showing white against the dark fabric. The mask of gentle piety was slipping steadily, revealing something far more calculating beneath the surface of clerical respectability. "And then there's the matter of access," Miss Marple observed conversationally. "The still-room window that provided such convenient entry when you borrowed Mrs. Thornfield's candle molds. Someone familiar with that arrangement would understand exactly when the room might be accessible without requiring the key that never left her person." The accumulation of evidence was becoming overwhelming, each detail precisely fitted into a pattern that revealed not just opportunity and method, but the twisted psychology that had driven such elaborate cruelty. Miss Marple's gentle but relentless questioning was exposing the fundamental resentment that had motivated months of systematic destruction. The confession emerges. "You must understand," Reverend Hartley said suddenly, his voice carrying a note of desperate justification. She was destroying everything Charles had worked to build. The family reputation, the careful order he had established, the proper respect due to his memory. She was turning his sacred legacy into a commercial enterprise, selling his treasures to strangers. The confession emerged like water through a failing dam, gathering force as psychological pressure finally overcame years of careful self-control. Inspector Aberley moved closer, his notebook ready to capture every word of what promised to be a complete revelation of the crime's true nature. "Charles trusted me with his deepest concerns about Lydia's character," Reverend Hartley continued, his voice growing stronger as he embraced the role of righteous protector. "He feared she saw him only as a source of security, that she would squander everything he had accumulated through faithful service. He asked me to watch over her, to guide her toward more appropriate behavior." Miss Marple observed this transformation with the fascination of someone watching a carefully constructed mask finally fall away. The gentle cleric was revealing himself as something far more complex and dangerous, a man who had convinced himself that elaborate cruelty served noble purposes. The full revelation. But guidance proved insufficient, he continued, his eyes now bright with the fervor of someone finally able to speak their truth. She ignored every suggestion, dismissed every attempt at proper direction. The candle-making became an obsession that consumed her thoughts and energy. She spoke of Charles's memory as if it were merely raw material for her commercial ambitions. The psychological profile that emerged was chilling in its self-righteousness. Here was someone who had appointed himself guardian of another person's legacy, who had gradually escalated from disapproval to systematic destruction when his authority was rejected. The months of poisoning, sabotage, and psychological manipulation had been justified in his mind as necessary correction of an ungrateful widow's behavior. The memorial ceremony was designed as her final test, he explained with theological precision. 3 identical candles, but only one appropriate choice. The memorial candle she had crafted with her own hands. If she had chosen correctly, if she had shown genuine reverence for Charles' memory, she would have lived. The decision was entirely hers to make. Inspector Aberley found himself facing a confession that revealed not only the technical details of an elaborate murder, but the twisted psychology that had driven it. This was not a crime of passion or simple greed, but the methodical execution of what the killer believed to be divine justice, carried out with the patience and attention to detail that characterized his clerical training. The final truth. Miss Marple, who had encountered many forms of village evil in her long experience, recognized this particular variety with a mixture of sadness and determination. The most dangerous criminals, she had learned, were often those who convinced themselves that their actions served higher purposes, who transformed cruelty into righteousness through elaborate self-deception. And if she chose incorrectly? She asked quietly, though the answer was already clear from the tragic events they had witnessed. Reverend Hartley met her gaze with eyes that showed no trace of remorse, only the cold satisfaction of someone who believed justice had been served. Then she would demonstrate, finally and definitively, that she was unworthy of the trust Charles had placed in her. The choice would reveal her true nature, and appropriate consequences would follow. The confession was complete, laying bare a mind that had transformed pastoral care into systematic persecution, religious duty into elaborate murder. As Inspector Aberley prepared to make his arrest, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar cruelty of a crime that had turned the victim's own devotion and expertise against her, creating a trap that was both psychologically perfect and morally monstrous. The widow who lit the wrong candle had indeed made a fatal choice, but it was a choice orchestrated with diabolical precision by someone who believed himself to be serving God's will through the methodical destruction of a human life. In the end, Reverend Stephen Hartley's clever hands had crafted not just a murder weapon, but a monument to the dangerous intersection of religious fanaticism and wounded masculine pride that had consumed Meadowbank House, in shadows darker than any autumn evening. The confession hung in the morning air like incense gone, sour, transforming the comfortable room into something resembling a tribunal where divine justice had been perverted into calculated cruelty. Inspector Aberley moved with professional precision, his handcuffs emerging with the quiet authority of someone who had witnessed many such moments of truth, though few had revealed such elaborate evil disguised as pastoral concern. Reverend Hartley made no attempt to flee or resist, his earlier agitation replaced by an unsettling calm that spoke of someone finally unburdened of a terrible secret. As the metal clicked into place, he turned to Miss Marple with an expression that might have been gratitude, as if her patient questioning had provided the absolution he had been seeking through months of elaborate deception. "You understand, don't you, Miss Marple?" he said quietly, his voice carrying the same gentle tone that had comforted countless parishioners through their darkest hours. Charles was a good man who deserved better than to have his memory commercialized by someone who saw him merely as a source of security. I was protecting his legacy. Miss Marple regarded him with the steady gaze of someone who had encountered many forms of village evil, recognizing this particular variety as among the most dangerous. "I understand that you convinced yourself your actions were justified, Reverend," she replied with characteristic directness. "But what you protected was not Commander Thornfield's memory. It was your own wounded pride at being dismissed by a woman who refused to accept your authority over her life." The immediate aftermath. There was a curious quiet in the room after the handcuffs closed. Not the hush of shock, but the soft emptiness that follows the snapping of a tight string. The news spread through Meadowbank House with the speed of wildfire, transforming the carefully maintained facade of respectability into a scene of profound disbelief. Jeremy Caldwell, who had been on the verge of arrest himself only hours before, stood trembling by the window, his relief warring with horror at the true identity of the killer. "The Reverend?" he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. But he was always so kind, so understanding about Mrs. Thornfield's difficulties. Mrs. Ashford, for all her earlier composure, now looked genuinely shaken, her carefully constructed world of village propriety shattered by the revelation. Even Dr. Pembroke, whose own misguided actions had contributed to Mrs. Thornfield's prolonged suffering, seemed to shrink into himself, overwhelmed by the monstrous implications of such calculated manipulation. Mrs. Prudence Blackwood found her pen still for once, her usual journalistic enthusiasm replaced by genuine shock that transcended her desire to record every detail. The sheer audacity and methodical coldness of the crime, combined with the identity of its perpetrator, proved almost too much for even the village's most dedicated chronicler to absorb. The technical resolution. Inspector Aberley's methodical review of the evidence painted a chilling portrait of premeditated murder disguised as pastoral concern. The timeline revealed that Reverend Hartley's campaign had begun shortly after Mrs. Thornfield rejected his suggestion that she donate her late husband's medals to the church memorial fund rather than selling them to support her independence. The systematic sabotage began approximately 6 weeks ago, the inspector documented with professional precision. Using his pastoral visits and the convenient window access established during the children's craft project, he introduced inferior candles into her inventory while removing her genuine work. Each substitution was crafted to appear correct while containing subtle flaws that would damage her reputation with discriminating customers. The forensic analysis revealed remarkable sophistication. The arsenical tincture prepared using 19th century medical texts, the precise knotwork from his naval chaplaincy service, the psychological manipulation that exploited Mrs. Thornfield's deepest emotions and predictable habits. It was not simply murder, but the methodical destruction of a human being's entire world, carried out with the patience and attention to detail that characterized his clerical training. Community and character resolution. As the day progressed, the quiet village of Little Wickham began to grapple with the unsettling truth. The arrest of their spiritual guide sent tremors through the community, shattering the comforting illusion of peace and piety that had long defined their lives. Some claimed they always knew there was something odd about him, while others clung to disbelief, unable to reconcile the man who had christened their children with the calculating killer now in custody. Jeremy found himself simultaneously relieved and guilt-stricken, wondering how he had failed to recognize his employer's systematic persecution. Mrs. Greeley, with characteristic practicality, began the process of restoring order to the household, understanding that love often expresses itself through work when tears seem inadequate. Dr. Pembroke returned to his surgery to face the professional consequences of his misguided intervention, finding some relief in finally agreeing to pay the price he owed. Practical arrangements and legacy. The practical outcomes unfolded with the plain usefulness that follows tragedy. Mrs. Thornfield's candle-making equipment would be donated to the village craft guild, ensuring her techniques would benefit others rather than disappearing with her death. The London contract, which had been genuine despite Hartley's sabotage, provided a modest legacy for charitable purposes, while Jeremy took on the responsibility of fulfilling her pending orders as a final tribute to her professional reputation. The medals returned from Bath, the collector having decided the transaction seemed unfortunate in light of recent events. A quiet ceremony placed them in a simple glass case in the church, where they could be properly remembered with a small card telling the truth about how they had come and gone. Miss Marple thought this appropriate. The truth, she had learned, was surprisingly good at its work when given a proper frame. Miss Marple's departure and reflection. On her final afternoon at Meadowbank House, Miss Marple took her knitting to the bench beneath the old oak where the memorial ceremony had begun, considering the small economies of wickedness that made such tragedies possible. The sun made a thin, kind effort, laying pale ribbons across the lawn, where the roses looked less like ghosts in the gentle light. Inspector Aberley came to take his leave, standing in companionable silence before speaking. "I've learned something here about the way a person can design not just a death, but a story around it, making that story so convenient that one is tempted to believe it simply because it's neat. I'll remember to look for the unfiled papers." Miss Marple smiled, pleased. "One should always notice where the dust has not settled, Inspector. It's very telling." He hesitated before continuing. "I've never liked that phrase people used about Mrs. Thornfield, about lighting the wrong candle. It isn't right. She didn't choose wrongly. Someone orchestrated that choice long before the match was struck." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. "We are creatures of habit, and our habits become the handles by which we can be so easily manipulated. The wise learn their own patterns, so that others cannot make use of them. Lydia trusted her artistic instincts, and that trust had served her well, until a cruel mind turned it into a weapon against her." The eternal verities. As her carriage pulled away from Meadowbank House, Miss Marple reflected on the case that would be remembered not just for its technical sophistication, but for its revelation of how easily virtue could be perverted into vice when pride and resentment festered beneath respectability's surface. The most dangerous criminals, she had learned, were often those who convinced themselves that cruelty served noble purposes, who transformed personal grievances into righteous crusades. The village would heal, as villages do, through the patient application of ordinary kindness and the gradual restoration of trust. But the memory of the widow who lit the wrong candle would serve as a reminder that beneath even the most tranquil communities, the darkest secrets could lie in wait, patient and methodical, until the precise moment they delivered their most devastating impact. In time, Jeremy would tie his wicks without sermons, understanding that knots burned more kindly when crafted with care rather than theology. The still room would smell of lavender without any sourness beneath, and somewhere in a glass case, medals would glint in honest light, a proper memorial to a man whose memory had been both betrayed and ultimately restored. The truth had indeed emerged like candlelight piercing darkness, illuminating not just the facts of murder, but the eternal verities of human nature that made such tragedies both possible and, through understanding and justice, ultimately conquerable. Miss Marple, who knew a great deal about both blue candles and the human heart, folded her hands contentedly in her lap as the peaceful countryside passed by her window, carrying its own quiet stories of light and shadow, virtue and vice, and the endless, fascinating complexity of village life. The days that followed Reverend Hartley's arrest brought a peculiar quiet to Little Wickham, as if the village had collectively drawn breath and was learning, slowly and carefully, how to exhale again. Miss Marple observed this process with the patient attention she brought to all human endeavors, understanding that healing from such elaborate deception required time and deliberate effort from the entire community. The practical restoration of order. Inspector Aberley, who possessed the admirable quality of finishing tasks properly once begun, returned with a small team to address the numerous practical matters that such crimes inevitably produced. His methodical approach brought comfort to those who had been shaken by the revelation that their spiritual guide was capable of such calculated cruelty. Jeremy worked late in the still room each evening, his movements acquiring a steadiness that spoke of both grief and resolution. The first time he tied a wick after the arrest, his fingers hesitated at the knot. Then he smiled ruefully, undid the elaborate flourish he had learned to admire, and tied a plain, workmanlike fastening instead. No naval cleverness, no theological precision, simply honest craft. When he tested the burn, it was even and quiet, producing the gentle light that Mrs. Thornfield had always intended her candles to provide. The business arrangements fell into place with surprising smoothness. Mrs. Thornfield's remaining orders were fulfilled using her genuine techniques and materials, while the London firm agreed to honor their original contract despite the tragic circumstances. The modest income would support the village craft guild in her memory, ensuring that her knowledge would benefit others rather than disappearing with her death. Individual reckonings and growth. Mrs. Ashford surprised herself by requesting a private meeting with Miss Marple before the latter's departure. The interview began with characteristic frost, but gradually thawed into something approaching humility, a recognition that her disapproval of Lydia, while not criminal, had created an atmosphere that made systematic persecution easier to accomplish. "I should like to arrange a proper memorial for my brother," she said, her voice carrying uncharacteristic uncertainty. "Something simple, unscented beeswax, perhaps, and Miss Marple." She paused, gathering courage. "I believe I shall place it on the left." Lydia would not have liked to think a choice could be engineered for her. Dr. Pembroke faced his professional reckoning with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that good intentions could not excuse harmful actions. His medical board hearing would be thorough but fair, recognizing both his cooperation in the investigation and his genuine remorse for the unintended consequences of his misguided intervention. Community healing and restored trust. The village's process of rebuilding trust proved more complex than simply accepting Hartley's guilt. People struggled to reconcile the gentle cleric who had christened their children with the calculating killer now in custody. Some claimed they had always sensed something odd about him, while others clung to disbelief, unable to process such a fundamental betrayal of sacred trust. Mrs. Prudence Blackwood found herself in the unusual position of moderating rather than amplifying village gossip. When the phrase, "the widow who lit the wrong candle," began circulating, she took it upon herself to correct the narrative, explaining patiently that Mrs. Thornfield had not chosen poorly. Rather, someone had deliberately removed the possibility of a safe choice. The church vestry underwent thorough cleaning and reorganization, with a young curate taking inventory and ensuring that proper security measures were implemented. The memorial case for Commander Thornfield's medals was installed with appropriate ceremony, bearing a simple plaque that told the truth about their journey from home to Collector and back again. Miss Marple's final observations. On her last afternoon at Meadowbank House, Miss Marple took her knitting to the bench beneath the old oak where the memorial ceremony had begun. The autumn sun made a gentle effort, laying pale ribbons across the lawn where the roses looked less ghostly in the forgiving light. Inspector Aberley came to take his leave, standing in comfortable silence before speaking. "I've learned something important here about the way a person can design not just a death, but an entire story around it, making that story so convenient that one is tempted to believe it simply because it appears neat. I'll remember to look for the places where the dust hasn't settled naturally." Miss Marple smiled with genuine pleasure. "One should always notice where things appear too perfectly arranged, Inspector. Human nature is rarely so obliging as to provide such tidy solutions." She reflected on the case's deeper implications as her carriage prepared for departure. The most dangerous criminals, she had observed, were often those who convinced themselves that cruelty served noble purposes, who transformed personal grievances into righteous crusades. Reverend Hartley had not simply committed murder. He had perverted the very concepts of pastoral care and divine justice to serve his wounded pride and need for control. The enduring lessons. The phrase, "the widow who lit the wrong" candle, would indeed be remembered, but with its meaning properly understood. Lydia Thornfield had not made a fatal error in judgment. She had been the victim of an elaborate psychological trap designed by someone who had studied her habits with malevolent precision. Her trust in her own artistic instincts, which had served her well throughout her life, had been weaponized against her by a mind capable of transforming virtue into vulnerability. As the peaceful countryside passed by her window, Miss Marple considered the eternal verities that made such tragedies both possible and ultimately conquerable. Human nature remained constant in its complexity, capable of both profound goodness and calculated evil, often existing within the same community, sometimes within the same individual. The challenge lay in maintaining sufficient wisdom to distinguish between appearance and reality, between genuine virtue and its clever counterfeits. The return to normalcy. Jeremy would continue his work with Mrs. Thornfield's techniques, but he would tie his knots simply and honestly, understanding that true craftsmanship required no elaborate flourishes to prove its worth. The still room would smell of lavender without any underlying sourness, and somewhere in a glass case, medals would reflect honest light, a proper memorial to a man whose memory had been both betrayed and ultimately restored. The village would heal, as villages do, through the patient application of ordinary kindness and the gradual restoration of trust. But the memory of this case would serve as a lasting reminder that, beneath even the most tranquil communities, the darkest secrets could lie in wait, patient and methodical, until the precise moment they chose to reveal their true nature. Miss Marple, who understood a great deal about both blue candles and the human heart, folded her hands contentedly in her lap as she returned to St. Mary Mead. The truth had indeed emerged like candlelight piercing darkness, illuminating not just the facts of murder, but the fundamental patterns of human behavior that made such crimes both tragic and, through understanding and justice, ultimately conquerable. In time, the still room would produce honest light again, and the village would remember not just the horror of deception, but the triumph of patient observation and unwavering commitment to truth. The weeks following Reverend Hartley's arrest brought a peculiar quiet to Little Wickham, as if the village collectively held its breath while learning to exhale again. Miss Marple, having returned to the familiar comfort of St. Mary Mead, found herself maintaining correspondence with several members of the community as the aftermath of the case slowly unfolded through the gentle rhythm of village life. Letters and lasting connections. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, bearing the county constabulary's official seal alongside a more personal note in Inspector Aberley's careful hand. His communication was characteristically concise but thoughtful, reporting that Reverend Hartley had made a complete confession during his psychological evaluation. The vestry cache had yielded 2 additional treated wicks, confirming the systematic nature of his preparation, while the bath collector had positively identified him as the gentleman who had delivered Commander Thornfield's medals with such convincing clerical authority. The laboratory confirmed the same arsenical tincture in all evidence recovered, Inspector Aberley wrote, including that library mantelpiece candle that might have claimed another victim had circumstances been different. I find myself permanently altered by your observation about dust that settles where one expects it to be swept. I shall be far more suspicious of convenient solutions in future cases. Jeremy's letter arrived 3 days later, written in his careful clerk's hand, but showing the telltale blots of someone trying not to weep onto the paper. The London firm had honored their contract despite the tragic circumstances, sending both acceptance and a modest but respectable first remittance. I've completed the first dozen candles strictly according to Mrs. Thornfield's notes. he wrote with touching formality, though I confess I've abandoned any elaborate flourishes in the knot work. Simple ties seem more honest somehow, and they burn just as true. Enclosed was a small twist of blue ribbon from his packaging, and, wrapped carefully in tissue, a sliver of deep blue wax that held the pure scent of rosemary and lavender without any underlying sweetness or corruption. Miss Marple found herself requiring her spectacles to examine it properly, touched by the young man's thoughtful gesture of sharing something clean and honest from the work that had been so cruelly perverted. Community healing and seasonal restoration. As autumn deepened into winter and then gradually yielded to spring's tentative promise, the village began the slow process of rebuilding trust and understanding. Mrs. Prudence Blackwood, who had appointed herself chronicler of the entire affair, took particular care to correct the narrative that had initially emerged. Her account, circulated only among the Ladies' Guild and never sent to any sensational newspaper, made a crucial point that Miss Marple heartily endorsed. Lydia Thornfield had not lit the wrong candle at all, but had been deliberately deprived of any safe choice by someone who mistook control for care. "It is extraordinary," Mrs. Blackwood wrote in one of her periodic updates to Miss Marple, "how we all accepted that dreadful phrase initially, as if it somehow explained the tragedy. A neat phrase is rather like a tidy drawer. One must shake it out occasionally to see what uncomfortable truths have been stuffed at the back." The practical arrangements fell into place with the steady efficiency that characterized village life at its best. Mrs. Thornfield's candle-making equipment was donated to the newly established craft guild, ensuring her techniques would benefit others rather than disappearing with her death. The still room at Meadowbank House was thoroughly cleaned and reorganized, its atmosphere of secrecy and manipulation replaced by honest sunlight and the simple tools of legitimate craft. Individual transformations and growth. Mrs. Ashford surprised everyone, including herself, by undergoing the most dramatic personal transformation. Her initial frost gradually thawed into something approaching humility as she grappled with how her disapproval, while not criminal, had created an atmosphere that made Hartley's systematic persecution easier to accomplish and conceal. She arranged for a proper memorial to her brother, a simple beeswax candle, unscented and honest, placed deliberately on the left side of the memorial case rather than the center. Charles would not have liked to think a choice could be engineered for anyone. She wrote to Miss Marple with characteristic directness, "I find that sentiment acquired late may be more valuable than that paraded early, though I wish I had learned this lesson at less terrible cost." Dr. Pembroke faced his professional reckoning with quiet dignity, his medical board hearing recognizing both his cooperation in the investigation and his genuine remorse for the unintended consequences of his misguided intervention. His tincture, weak, had indeed been meant as treatment rather than poison, though the board emphasized that good intentions could never excuse actions that caused harm. His temporary suspension provided time for reflection on the dangerous line between intervention and manipulation, emerging as a more cautious and genuinely compassionate practitioner. The correction of understanding. Perhaps the most significant healing came through the community's gradual understanding of what had actually occurred. The phrase, "the widow who lit the wrong candle," was systematically replaced with a more accurate narrative, one that recognized Lydia as the victim of an elaborate psychological trap rather than someone who had made a fatal error in judgment. The young curate who replaced Reverend Hartley made this understanding literal in his first Easter service, placing a single beeswax candle on the left side of the chancel step rather than the center. His explanation, though awkward, carried genuine feeling. It does people good to see that not everything must be symmetrical to be properly ordered. Sometimes the most beautiful arrangements are those that allow genuine choice rather than manufactured inevitability. Jeremy embraced this philosophy in his continuing work with Mrs. Thornfield's techniques. When fulfilling orders, he began setting 2 candles closer together and placing the third slightly apart, discovering that People choose more variously when the pattern is not so insistent. His simple observation delighted Miss Marple, who recognized in it a practical application of wisdom earned through tragedy. Miss Marple's final reflections. On a soft evening in late spring, Miss Marple sat in her cottage garden beneath the blooming laburnum, her knitting needles maintaining their familiar rhythm as she reflected on the case that had revealed so much about human nature's capacity for both cruelty and redemption. The small sliver of blue wax that Jeremy had sent sat in a simple saucer on her window-sill, its scent now faded to nothing more than clean candle and a little dust, appropriate, she thought, since wickedness fades when not deliberately nourished, while goodness requires constant practice to maintain its strength. The case had reinforced her understanding that the most dangerous criminals were often those who convinced themselves that elaborate cruelty served noble purposes. Reverend Hartley had not simply committed murder. He had perverted the very concepts of pastoral care and divine justice to serve his wounded pride and compulsive need for control. His months-long campaign of systematic poisoning and psychological manipulation revealed a mind capable of transforming virtue into vice when personal authority was challenged or rejected. Yet the resolution also demonstrated the quiet power of truth and the fundamental decency that could emerge even from the darkest circumstances. Jeremy's honest craftsmanship, Mrs. Ashford's hard-won humility, Dr. Pembroke's genuine remorse, and the community's determination to understand rather than simply condemn, all represented small victories in the eternal struggle between understanding and prejudice, between compassion and control. The enduring legacy. As the months passed, Little Wickham settled into a new rhythm that acknowledged both its loss and its growth. The memorial garden at Meadowbank House became a place of genuine peace rather than manufactured sentiment, tended by volunteers who understood that remembrance required honesty rather than elaborate ceremony. Commander Thornfield's medals gleamed in their simple case, bearing a plain brass plaque that read only, "Served faithfully," words that honored the man without the embellishment that had masked so much deception. The candles produced under Jeremy's careful supervision burned with steady, even light, their scent pleasant without the cloying sweetness that had concealed poison. His success provided tangible evidence that truth and straightforward craft could triumph over deception and false sophistication, while his simple approach to knotwork served as a daily reminder that genuine skill required no elaborate flourishes to prove its worth. Miss Marple smiled contentedly as she gathered her knitting, reflecting that the world was not mended by grand gestures so much as by small corrections attended to in time. The widow had not lit the wrong candle in any moral sense. The wrongness had been carefully arranged by someone who mistook mastery for virtue. The rightness, such as it could be, had been restored afterward by many hands, clumsy perhaps, well-meaning certainly, but ultimately honest hands that had learned to tie simpler knots and make genuine choices. Somewhere in a church, medals reflected honest light. Somewhere in a still room that no longer felt like a trap, a young man practiced his craft with integrity. Somewhere, a sister who had been too proud was learning humility through brass letters and unscented flames. And somewhere in a police office, an inspector had developed the habit of questioning who benefited from tidy stories before allowing himself to admire their convenient neatness. The truth had indeed emerged like candlelight piercing darkness, illuminating not just the facts of murder but the eternal verities of human nature that made such crimes both tragic and, through understanding and justice, ultimately conquerable. In time, honest candles would burn throughout Little Wickham with steady, untroubled light, and the village would remember not just the horror of elaborate deception, but the triumph of patient observation and unwavering commitment to truth over the shadows where evil preferred to hide.